In the fall of 1798, 17 travelers vanished without a trace along a 20-mile stretch of the wilderness road in the remote mountains of southeastern Kentucky. They left behind nothing but abandoned horses and scattered baggage pieces that told no story. What makes these disappearances so chilling isn't just the number, it's the fact that any records of their investigation were covered up by local authorities, carefully, deliberately, and completely for more than 2 centuries. You're listening to Sleepy History Tales, where we tell historical mysteries while you relax sometimes before you fall asleep. If you're anywhere in the United States, let us know in the comments Kentucky, Virginia, or beyond. We love hearing from you. Now, come with me back to the wilderness of 1798, where a peaceful farmhouse hid a terrifying secret. The most gruesome organized murder in pioneer American history. It all began not with screams in the night, but with a chance discovery. A county clerk cleaning out old documents in the dusty basement of the county courthouse discovered a sealed file that had been sealed for hundreds of years. And inside was a truth that had been buried for far too long. At the time, southeastern Kentucky was still a thin line between civilization and wilderness. It offered the promise of opportunity for those who dared to venture west, but it also posed deadly dangers. The wilderness road blazed by Daniel Boone through the Cumberland Gap was a vital route for pioneers from Virginia and the Carolinas. The road wound through the Appalachian Mountains like a thin thread through the untamed jungle. One wrong step could mean death from lost paths, wild animals, or worst of all, people. Along the way, small communities sprang up like mushrooms after a rain. Small stations where families stopped to rest, gather supplies, and hear from those who had gone before. One of the most important stops was the town of Millfield, located at a dangerous bend where the trail dropped into the fertile valley of Beaver Creek. The population is only about 300, a place where everyone knows each other, or so they think. Millfield was founded in 1794 by a group of Baptists from Virginia, seeking religious freedom, and religion permeates every beat of life here. Every Sunday, the whole town gathers in the small wooden church. Strict rules apply to everything from drinking to dancing. The center of town was Hendrick's General Store, a weathered wooden house. Jeremiah Hendriss, an old veteran who had fought alongside Daniel Boone himself, ran it. He was stern, resourceful, and never lost a cent of profit. Next door was the Cumberland Inn, considered the most luxurious from Lexington to the Virginia frontier. The innkeeper was the widow, Martha Crane, a woman from Philadelphia, who brought her capital and eastern flair to create a comfortable, warm place to stay with hot food and polite conversation. But the heart of Millfield was the New Jerusalem Baptist Church. Every Sunday, the entire community came to hear Reverend Ephraim Cole preach. Cole had been educated at Harvard, but had left behind a promising career in Boston to bring faith to the frontier. His sermons were not only biblical, but also about survival in the harsh outdoors. There was one family in Millfield, the most respected of all the Hardins. Mr. Ezekiel, his wife, Mrs. Temperance, and their 3 grown children, 2 sons, Caleb and Josiah, and a daughter, Mercy. And from there, the Hardin secret begins to emerge silently, coldly, like the morning mist that covers the southern woods. But we won't rush. Are you awake? Stay with me, because what's about to happen will make you never look at old cabins along the trail the same way again. The Hardins arrived in Millfield in the spring of 1791. They said they were survivors of a devastating Indian raid in eastern Virginia. Their old home burned down, their family scattered. They arrived empty-handed, but within a few years they had become pillars of the town. Ezekiel Hardin, tall, imposing, broad-shouldered as an oak, was a man who silenced a room just by entering. His deep, bell-like voice would accompany Reverend Cole on every major holiday. Tears would come to his eyes as he described the mercy of God, or warned of the fires of hell in a voice that still sent chills down the spine. Ezekiel, it was said, preached as if he had stood between heaven and hell, as if he had seen it. Temperance Hardin, on the other hand, was the personification of restless silence. The petite woman with prematurely grey hair and busy hands became Millfield's unknown physician. She knew how to treat broken bones, malaria-difficult childbirth, with mysterious herbs that grew somewhere in the jungle and few people knew the names. Many families survived the crisis, thanks to Temperance's gentle knock on the door in the middle of the night. The three Hardin children seemed to be the epitome of frontier morality. Caleb, 26, was strong and devoted, inheriting both his father's physique and his mother's gentleness. He not only worked on the family farm but also helped the old men and women in the area repair their barns. Josiah, 2 years younger, was intelligent and calm, often teaching the children to read and write during the winter when the fields were quiet. Mercy, 22, was considered one of the most beautiful and virtuous girls in the area. She kept careful records of every visitor to the farm, every name, every date. At this point, you might be thinking a perfect family. Right. The Hardin farm, 3 miles south of town on Beaver Creek, stretched over 400 acres of fertile land. Ezekiel had spent nearly all his savings on the land, but it had paid back many times over. Corn, tobacco, wheat, enough to support not only his family, but also a portion of the town. The main house, 2 stories, solid, wood stone, chimney glass windows, was so rare that one would only see it in the pages of Oriental books. Inside, the furniture was exquisitely carved, including imported China silver candlesticks and a bookcase that not every Kentucky clergyman could afford. The stable could hold 50 horses. There was a blacksmith, a smokehouse, a dairy, and what Ezekiel called the largest cellar in the county. People laughed at that, but no one was allowed to see inside. But what made the Hardins special wasn't their wealth, it was their kindness. They opened their doors to strangers, to the hungry, the cold, the injured, the lost, or even to those with nothing but tired feet. Almost every week, someone came to the farmhouse asking for help. Ezekiel would ride through the freezing rain to pull a wagon with a broken axle. And Temperance would never sleep, always ready to bandage and cure whether the sick had money or not. In a small outhouse, she kept a full-fledged medical station, scalpels, medicines, rubbing alcohol so much that it would have impressed even the mountain doctors. And then their reputation spread. By 1798, travelers were regularly directed to the Hardin farm as a reliable stop. A place with warm beds, hot meals, kindness, and free medical care. Mercy carefully recorded every visitor. Merchants, pastors, young families, vagabonds. Hundreds of people passed through. But not everyone left. In the harsh world of the trail, one learns one thing. Don't trust appearances. Don't be quick to call kindness real. Because sometimes the place that seems safest is the deepest trap. Are you still awake? If so, keep your eyes open because the next part will make us start to look at each action of the Hardin family with new eyes. Eyes that are no longer blinded by the light of kindness. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on October 13th, 1798. A merchant named Samuel Fletcher failed to arrive in Lexington on his regular schedule for more than a decade. Fletcher was no newcomer to the woods. He was one of the most seasoned and trusted traders on the Wilderness Road. Time was money on the frontier, they said, and Fletcher knew how to turn it into real money. For 12 years, he had traveled between Virginia and Kentucky 4 times a year, carrying manufactured goods west and raw materials east. Never late. Never more than a day's silence. So when Thomas Greeley, his longtime partner, heard nothing after 5 days of absolute silence, he knew. Something was wrong, something bad. On the morning of October 18th, Greeley began retracing the familiar route, following Fletcher's footsteps from Lexington back east. He stopped at every inn, questioned every farmer, every shopkeeper. Everyone confirmed Fletcher had passed through here, on time, on the right route. Everything was clear, until Greeley approached Millfield. Here, Fletcher seemed to disappear from the world. At noon on the second day of searching, Greeley discovered Fletcher's horse, a bay stallion, easily recognizable, grazing leisurely on the banks of Miller Creek, still saddled, unwounded, even looking as if it had been fed. The strangest thing was, the bridle was not torn. It had been unfastened and neatly hung on a nearby tree branch. Someone had taken care of the horse. Someone knew how to handle things neatly. Too neatly. The saddlebags were intact. The goods were intact. And in the leather money bag was nearly $50 silver of fortune for a merchant in those days. Robbery. No. No one would leave that much money behind. But what sent chills down one's spine wasn't the horse. It was Fletcher's personal effects, gloves, a scarf, a small leather notebook falling one by one, in a line that stretched off the trail deep into the woods, as if he were being dragged, as if he were leaving behind every trace, hoping someone would see it. At this point, Sheriff Jacob Winters stepped in. He had been a sergeant in the Continental Army, fighting under Anthony Wayne in the Ohio campaigns. A man who knew the cruelty of the frontier and rarely believed the obvious. Winters knew right away this was no ordinary disappearance, and he prepared for it. He assembled a search party of 12. The most familiar faces in Millfield. Among them was Henrik Johansson, a Swede with a tracking talent as good as the natives, and Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter who once stalked 50 miles around the area. The faint blood, the torn cloth caught in thorns, the dragging footprints, all led in one direction, the Hardin farm. But when they reached the Hardin property line, the trail stopped, abrupt, clean, as if an invisible hand had lifted Fletcher off the ground. Johansson, who could follow the squirrel's footprints through the woods, shook his head. He had never seen anything so strange. Winters himself went to ask Ezekiel Hardin, And the burly old man's response was both polite and seemingly pre-planned. Yes, Ezekiel replied. Fletcher stopped by on the afternoon of October 13th, asked for a shortcut to Lexington. I advised him not to. It was dangerous, especially with winter coming. But he insisted. Something didn't fit. A seasoned merchant like Fletcher, who avoided risk and was always punctual, would take an unfamiliar shortcut and disappear right on the boundary of the land of the most famous and virtuous family in the area. What do you think? According to Ezekiel Hardin, Fletcher stopped by the farm on the afternoon of October 13th, just before dusk. He was polite, but clearly in a hurry, declining an invitation to dinner and a night's sleep with a faint smile. Fletcher said he needed to make the most of the last light of day to move on. But his eyes said otherwise, glancing back, his hands tightening on his saddle straps and checking his leather satchel. Ezekiel says Fletcher was nervous. Nervous. He had warned him that it was dangerous to go into the hills after dark, but Fletcher didn't listen. He whispered that he had been followed since leaving Virginia. Strange men. He didn't say who. The entire Hardin family remembered that visit with uncanny precision. Everyone recounted the same details. Fletcher's urgency, his refusal to stay overnight, the bottle of drops Temperance had given him when he complained of a stomachache, and Caleb's refusal to escort him. Each account matched as if memorized. Not a single detail was out of place. To Constable Winters' experience, that was the clearest sign that something was wrong. Because in real life, witnesses were always wrong about little things, a phrase, the color of a shirt, the direction they were going. But here, too neat, too clean. The farm's atmosphere and the suspicious changes. As Winters walked through the farm, he noticed significant changes. A new smokehouse built of thick stone, unusually large for a family's needs. Some of the outbuildings around it showed signs of having been turned over, clearly some extensive digging. And the turnip cellar, the thing Ezekiel had always been proud of, had now doubled in size with a new wooden entrance wide enough to accommodate a wagon. When Winters asked, Ezekiel smiled serenely. The harvest was good. We needed a place to store and process it before we took it to Lexington to sell, he explained. The words made sense. The tone was convincing, but something was off. It was as if he were choosing each word with invisible gloves. What made Winters most wary was the atmosphere among the Hardins. Temperance, the woman who had always been steady, her hands restless now, had a shaking hand as she poured coffee. Mercy. The girl who had been known as gentle and approachable now glanced at her father every time she opened her mouth, as if asking permission to say each word. Caleb and Josiah, two famously friendly boys, were silent that day, their eyes alert, as if Winters' every question were a knife hidden in his cloak. But Winters had no evidence, no body, no weapon, no witnesses beyond his too perfect story. The records read, most likely robbed or attacked by natives. Fletcher just another tick in the long list of men who had not returned from the Western Trail. His horse was auctioned off to pay his debts. And a month later, the name Samuel Fletcher disappeared from the town's life as if he had never existed. But Fletcher was only the first. The winter of 1798. Then, The spring of 1799. Every 2 or 3 weeks, someone disappeared. No distinction between victims, creating a sense of quiet panic. No distinction between age. No distinction between rich and poor. Some were alone. Some were merchants carrying weapons. What did they have in common? They were all heading or asking for directions to the Hardin farm. In November, a doctor named Marcus Cromwell, on his way from Richmond to Louisville to open a practice, disappeared without a trace. He was a first aid man, a map man, a gunman. But in the end, he was just another name, scribbled in some traveler's diary, blown away by the wind in the Kentucky woods. Are you still following along? In this quiet night, have you ever wondered how much kindness is just a mask? The next missing person was Dr. Marcus Cromwell, 43. A careful, hard-working man, he had put his life together for one purpose: to bring medicine to the frontier. All his possessions, books, equipment, exquisite medical instruments were in the carriage he had driven himself. And then, that was all they found. Overturned on the side of the road near an area called Devil's Fork, just 3 miles from the Hardin farm. Property was strewn about the scene, but virtually untouched. No looting, no blood, no obvious signs of a raid. Only the medical leather case, which contained a rare surgical kit with bone saws and scalpels, was gone. No wild animal had taken such things. No robber had left behind money to take knives. December. The Henleys disappear. Jonathan Henley, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 children hunting for shelter from a blizzard. Their car got stuck in the snow less than half a mile from the Hardin farm. According to Ezekiel, they never made it and must have gotten lost in the cold freezing somewhere in the woods. That made sense until the car was found. A week later, the car had been pulled out of the snow. Clean, neat. The food was there. The tools were there. But the clothes and personal effects were gone. There were footprints all around, many of them. Someone had obviously worked together to free the car from the deep snow in a cold that could kill in minutes. But no one admitted to doing it. January. Reverend Nathan Cross, the backwoods minister who had survived many dangers, disappeared. He was the man everyone believed unstoppable. He preached in hail-crossed war zones, dodged arrows and traps. When he disappeared, everyone thought he had been robbed, but 3 days later his horse was found. Saddle intact. Saddlebag intact. With over $200 in donations from parishioners. Not a penny taken. Not a trace of blood. Just no cross. Each disappearance left a strange pattern. Personal belongings strewn, but not taken. The horse was found even tied carefully to a tree. The trail stopped, always stopped, near the Hardin farm. When asked, Hardin smiled. They had seen the man, but only from a distance. No talk. They had warned about the weather, about robberies, about the treacherous terrain. But the visitors didn't listen. They invited him to stay, but he refused. Must move on. It sounded too good, and each time Constable Winters felt more helpless. A law enforcement officer had no laws to use, no bodies, no witnesses outside the family, just intuition, an indescribable feeling, as if every time he stepped into the farmhouse gate, he was looking at something that shouldn't be in this world. Do you feel yourself starting to hold your breath? Don't worry, I'm still here. And what's coming next will keep you from leaving the blanket wrapped around your shoulders. The Hardin family remained the stalwarts of the land, an example of virtue and charity. All acknowledged it except one Constable Winters. Mr. Ezekiel, with his fiery and powerful sermons, drew admiration not only from the simple parishioners but also from learned ministers like Reverend Cole. Mrs. Temperance, with her angelic hands, saved dozens of lives during the summer fever epidemic last year. To many families, she was not just a doctor, but a living saint. And how could you accuse such people without proof? It was not an accusation, it was suicide. Winters knew that well. He had seen what happened to those who dared to touch powerful families, shunned, stripped of their positions, even accused in return. On this frontier, justice is not found in the law books, but in handshakes and polite thanks. An unspoken question is the truth buried under kindness. Whenever asked, the Hardins had a ready answer, correct, reasonable, and more importantly, believable, that the land was dangerous, that the forest roads were full of wild animals, bandits, Indians, floods, and blizzards. They were missing people every year. So why did they have to be paired with a nice family? But things started to fall apart. The narrator's voice became sharper. Only more and more disappearances were happening too close to the Hardin's farm, and too close together. When people disappeared, footprints led in the same direction. When the search began, the evidence vanished like morning mist. The Hardins were always open to interrogators offering help in the search, ready to check the house, the barn, the well, the barn. They were so ready that Constable Winters began to feel like he was being teased. It was as if they were saying, "You want to find, go ahead. You won't find anything." And then the first crack in that perfect mask appeared from a 9-year-old boy named Timothy Voran. Timothy was an inquisitive boy who wandered into the woods near his home just 2 miles from the Hardin farm. He often told strange stories: 2-headed wolves, giant birds, secret caves that no one paid much attention to, just laughed at. But in March 1799, Timothy came to Constable Winters with a story that no one laughed about. Timothy said he had heard screams coming from the direction of the Hardin farm many times. Not arguments, not accidents, not labor pains, but cries for help, long, intermittent, full of tears and fear. The screams lasted for hours, sometimes accompanied by strange sounds: the rhythmic pounding of hammers, the revolving of pulleys, and sometimes people chanting something in unison. And then everything stopped. Nothing, just absolute silence. Winters was about to let it go like every other time, but then Timothy remembered very clearly every night he heard the screams. And you know what? Every night, it was perfectly timed with the day a guest disappeared. Do you remember an overturned carriage? A carefully tied horse, a pastor missing without a trace? Now the screams in the night have crept in like a confession buried alive in the forest. Coincidences were no longer coincidences. The screams Timothy had heard in the night They matched exactly when the visitors had disappeared. Not once, 5 times. And that was enough. With Timothy's testimony as a foundation, Constable Winters began to build his case piece by piece, piece by piece. He knew if he was going to expose the Hardins, he had to have evidence that was irrefutable, that could not be distorted, that could not be denied. And so he proceeded. Quietly, Winters made no statements, no direct questions, no alarms. He just chatted quietly with the neighbors who lived around the Hardin farm. And gradually things began to emerge. Sarah Mitchell, who lived closest to the Hardins, said she often saw flickering lights at night, oil lamps, moving between houses when the good people were asleep. Some nights, she heard the sound of digging that continued until dawn. The sound of hammers, the sound of earth being pushed up, and sometimes something like a groan. When Sarah had asked Mrs. Temperance Hardin about it after church, the woman smiled kindly and said, "We're expanding the cellar and the barn. We're working at night to keep cool, and we have to tend to the crops during the day." The explanation made sense, but then thinking back, Sarah saw no sign of the earth being dug up. No new land, no building materials. Everything seemed gone. Then there was Henrik Johansson, the old Swedish hunter, quiet but respected throughout the area for his tracking skills. He found bones scattered along the fence that bordered the Hardin farm, not the bones of ordinary butchered animals. Instead, they were broken, gnawed, cooked, and scattered. He recognized the heads of cows and horses. But there were also pieces too small, too fragile, not belonging to any animal he had ever known. Some had been sawed cleanly, as if by a saw. Some bore signs of being cooked as if prepared for food or ritual. When pressed, Ezekiel shrugged. "The wild animals have been too fierce this year. We had to throw away the sick cattle to keep them away from us." The explanation sounded both right and wrong, but Johansson was not so easily convinced. He said the bones were too clean, too cooked, too deliberately scattered. These were not animal carcasses. These were something else. And the Hardin children, they had been friendly, lively before. Now, taciturn, quiet. Caleb and Josiah, two once cheerful and helpful young men, were now furtive, tense, avoiding eye contact, as if they were hiding something. But the strangest of all was Mercy Hardin, and I'll tell you about her next. There was no doubt about it. In the pile of bones found near the Harper's old hideout, personal belongings belonging to several missing people. It was no coincidence. It couldn't have been a mistake. They, the Harpers, had murdered many. But when the truth came out, they were gone. Not a trace, not a word of farewell, leaving only bodies, mysteries, and nameless nightmares. The manhunt lasted 6 months. And then it was abandoned, with the Harpers presumed to have died in the woods or fled to lands beyond the reach of the law. But if Isaac Brewster's story was true, then the Hardins weren't some new criminal organization. They were the Harpers of old rebranded, recast, and converted. A family of murderers had wandered from state to state, leaving behind not only blood, but a system. And in Kentucky, they had not merely repeated their crimes. They had refined, improved, perfected. No more haste, no more negligence. Everything was done with the calmness of someone who believed he was on a sacred mission. For Winters Brewster's testimony was like a weight hanging over his chest. He had the truth, but not the evidence the law would accept. On the frontier, justice was not easily dispensed. A false accusation could destroy a community, creating a slight climax with a sudden appearance. A ghost in the middle of the night. And then, the unexpected happened. On the night of May 22nd, 1799, a 22-year-old girl named Mercy Hardin appeared on the Winters' doorstep like a ghost, tears streaming down her face, hands shaking, deep fear in her eyes. Slowly, as if each word were a slow wave in the dark room. For 3 hours, Mercy told the story. Every detail, every crime, every soul judged by her family. According to Mercy, the murders began just a few months after they arrived in Kentucky. And since then, they have never stopped. But the most terrible thing was not the number of victims. It was how they were chosen, judged, and executed. Her father, Ezekiel Hardin, did not consider himself a murderer. He believed he was serving God, that he was given a mission to cleanse the unworthy souls who wandered the frontier trail. It all started with a phase they called appraisal. When a group of people came to stay, Ezekiel would engage in conversation, ask questions, pray, share morals, and all the while, he was assessing the rich accused of greed, the educated accused of arrogance, the parents of young children irresponsible for putting them in danger. Even the pastor could be accused of hypocrisy. If Ezekiel convicts someone, the family acts like a band of soldiers, invites them to stay overnight, welcomes them with a warm dinner, cares about the broken wheel, the tired horse. Then when night falls, justice is served. Once Ezekiel has made his judgment, the victim has no way back. But you know what's scariest? It's how it all starts. No knives, no blood, no screams. Just an invitation to dinner. The Hardin family is known for being generous. They open their doors to strangers, especially on windy nights or when it's pouring rain. A weary traveler child in hand, burdened with goods. Who can refuse a warm roof, a hot bowl of soup? Temperance, the mother, will prepare a small feast. Simple but thoughtful. The children, polite smart, play the piano chat, even recite poetry. And at the end of the night, Ezekiel will lead the family in prayer, his voice warm, deep, and enchanting. But hidden behind it all is the final dessert that no one sees. A herbal concoction researched by Temperance for years. Odorless, tasteless, mixed with black coffee or a shot of bourbon, and the visitor would feel exhausted. Like after a long day of traveling, they were invited to bed early in a clean, warm room, only to wake up a few hours later in the cold darkness, blinded, isolated, with no way out. Underground, directly below that peaceful house, was a network of dungeons stretching nearly 200 meters long. Many floors, stone steps, wooden ladders, and a large room that Ezekiel called the courtroom. A cold stone table serving as a judge's chair. Iron chains driven deep into the walls. Religious symbols twisted and distorted hung everywhere. Here Ezekiel held his trials, pretending to be justice, a reenactment of a cruel game dressed up in faith. But the most horrifying thing is they believe what they do is right. Ezekiel does not think of himself as a murderer. He believes himself to be God's enforcer of justice. Each execution is a purification. Not everyone is executed immediately. Some people, skilled, knowledgeable, are kept for weeks, even months. Take Dr. Cromwell, who disappeared in November. He was forced to train temperance in advanced surgery before being killed. Or Pastor Cross, who was forced to write dozens of sermons, which Ezekiel then preached as his own. The verdict is also varied: theft hanging, pride drowning, wealth and power, sacrificed in rituals Ezekiel considers scripturally approved. Every murder standardized, like the whole family was running a cult. If you find this story making your heart beat slow, you're not alone. Share this video with someone who enjoys dark mysteries. And if you're listening in the dark, don't forget to like and subscribe. We're going to dig deeper into buried secrets. Mercy has revealed everything. She tells not only about the crime, but also about the roles each member played. Caleb and Josiah, the two older brothers, were the main force. They captured victims, dug tunnels, transported bodies through limestone caves that led into the deepest part of the complex. And Mercy herself? She was forced to become the scribe. She recorded the identities of each victim, the property confiscated, the way the victims were treated. Every line, every page was evidence of the crime. And it is also a sin she cannot erase. Mercy had kept it all, not in her memory, on paper. Her handwriting, small, careful, persistent, had filled dozens of notebooks. But this was not a diary. It was an inventory. The only difference was the items recorded were human lives, names, ages, levels of wealth, clothing, items carried, even their last words, their expressions as they were held captive. Who was silent? Who begged? Who rebelled? Each person was reduced to a single entry, then disappeared. Temperance, the mother, played the most important role. She was the one who mixed the anesthetic, the kind that put victims to sleep after a tiring journey. But more than that, she was the doctor, the executioner, and the torturer. Using her medical knowledge from years on the frontier, Temperance had turned her life-saving skills into a precise torture tool. Not to kill, just enough to break the spirit. She called it treatment. Who resisted a series of treatments that caused pain without leaving any external wounds. No knives, just the right nerves, until they were completely submissive. But the plan didn't stop there. To avoid detection, the Hardins had built an elaborate system of evidence destruction and misdirection. The bodies were never buried on the farm. They were transported through limestone tunnels leading to deep natural caves miles away. No one set foot there. No one suspected. The assets were carefully classified. Money, jewels, fine weapons, kept or sold in distant towns where no one asked questions. More prosaic items scattered along the roads, creating fake crime scenes, looting, or even native attacks. Clothing was also systematically disposed of. Useful items kept. Distinctive costumes burned. Even horses the most valuable and recognizable of all, were secretly sold through smugglers in distant districts. No one asked where, no one suspected. But the most effective concealer of crime was not limestone, not planning. It was kindness. Every act of charity, every healing by temperance, every sermon by Ezekiel, it was both real and a cover. Who would believe the man who saved children during the plague could kill dozens of people, and not just kill, systematically? They even prepared a response plan for the investigation. If danger was felt, halt the killing, double the charity, and if necessary, drop everything, retreat underground, like they did in Tennessee. Mercy said the family was planning to expand, not just one farm, a network. They had targeted several more remote areas along the forest road, where there was no law, no one to hear the screams. Each location would be a divine court, as Ezekiel called it, the goal to cleanse the border of unworthy people. Are you still listening? If you're sitting in the middle of the night, wondering how this could have happened, well, you're not alone. Like if you're still with me, and if you dare share this story with a friend, because the rest is even creepier. Are you thinking Mercy was telling all this out of guilty conscience? No, not at all. She confessed out of fear of death. Ezekiel, the father, the preacher, had become paranoid to the extreme. Anyone who questioned, anyone who might have suspected, was deserving of judgment. The list now included a few curious neighbors. Isaac Brewster, the businessman who had investigated the disappearance in Tennessee, and Constable Winters. And that wasn't the worst of it, Mercy revealed. There was someone else in custody. Right now. Underground. A surveyor, William Patterson, had been arrested 3 days earlier. The trial was to begin the following night. But he wasn't alone. There were 2 others. A young girl, Rebecca Foster, missing for over a week, and an old priest, Luther Grimby, gone for the month. 3 lives, 3 verdicts. One night, the Hardins were no longer a group of opportunistic killers. They were a systematic, strategic execution machine. Those who were kept because they had value. Those who resisted were treated. Those whose deadlines had come were executed. Constable Winters understood immediately. Time was up for investigation. Time was up for procedure. If he did not act, now innocent people would die. But to confront the Hardins head-on was suicide. They had the weapons. They had the terrain. And they had prepared their whole lives for this eventuality. If Winters went it alone, he could die. The victim could be killed. The killer might escape. If he returned to Lexington for help, all 3 victims would not live to see morning. Then, something unexpected happened. He was not alone. Henrik Johansson, the quiet Swedish farmer, volunteered immediately. He had been a soldier. He knew the woods better than the back of his hand. Isaac Brewster, the peddler haunted by his past mistakes, joined in. He knew the Hardins' habits, how they hid, what made them vulnerable. Then came Benjamin Stokes, the former bounty hunter, Daniel Crawford, the veteran of the natives. They didn't need many men. Just men who wouldn't back down. They would attack after midnight, May 23. Use the darkness. Use the element of surprise. Pauses. Then presses priority. The goal is not to catch the killer. It's to rescue the victim. If they can't catch him alive, They're ready to finish off the Hardins. Mercy. Her voice trembling sketched out the entire layout of the farm. 2 entrances to the underground. One through the tree root basement. A secondary tunnel hidden in the woods nearly 400 meters from the house. That's all they have. Darkness. A group of brave men. And a glimmer of hope that they're not too late. Are you still awake? If your heart beats a little faster at the thought of that house in the woods, with its secrets groaning underground, then you're about to enter the end. The Hardins didn't just have a plan, they had a fort. They had hidden weapons at both entrances to the bunker. And Ezekiel, the father, the preacher, had trained his son in elaborate defensive tactics. If an attacker attacked, they would only have to hold out long enough for the family to escape through the cave system undetected. To reach the farm, the rescuers had to cross nearly a mile of open ground. One misstep, just one, and they would be discovered, and it would mean death for them and for those trapped underground. But Henrik Johansson, the Swedish farmer, the silent gunman, had eyes like a hawk. He led the group along hidden paths, along waterways, under the shade of trees. They moved as silently as hunters in winter. No one spoke. Everyone knew if they were discovered, there would be no turning back. Pauses slightly, then turns to horror. But as they approached the Hardin farm, it was even worse than Mercy's confession. The whole lot looked like it had been dug up, not for planting, not for crops, but for burial. Heaps of rubble and dirt. The smell of lime and corpses was thick in the air, as if the smell itself were alive. The main house was the opposite. Cozy, with lights on, smoke rising from the chimney like a normal family having dinner. But there were sounds coming from underground. Whispers, screams, muffled, and the steady thud of metal on stone, like a construction site. As the clock struck 2:00 a.m., the rescue began. Winters and Johansson approached the entrance to the bunker through the tree root basement. Stokes and Crawford circled quietly behind them, barricading themselves at the exit in the woods. Isaac Brewster staying with the horses, ready to provide cover fire if things went wrong. The entrance Mercy had described was just the surface. In fact, it was a fortified structure. The angle of fire had been calculated. The view was all around. Ezekiel didn't just preach. He built a death trap under the guise of a peaceful farm. But what the Hardins didn't have was surprise. After years of murdering without being caught, they were overconfident. When Winters and Johansson broke into the bunker, Ezekiel and his sons didn't have time to react. They were preparing for a trial, a death sentence for those trapped down there. William Patterson chained in a standing room stone cell, skinny, exhausted, but conscious. Rebecca Foster not so lucky. She bore the marks of Temperance's therapy. Cruel, precise, subduing. Luther Grimby, the old minister, was barely conscious, exhausted by both captivity and psychological torture. But that wasn't all. The deeper they went, the more horrifying it became. In the depths of the limestone cave, they discovered a silent cemetery. Bones, old clothes, personal items strewn everywhere. An archive of crimes that had lasted for nearly a decade. Each room was a story of death. Each item was irrefutable evidence. In addition to the bodies, the rescue team also found books, just as Mercy had said, handwritten, regularly written, tallying each case like an accounting book. Each page is a soul, recorded, weighed, and then disappeared. And now, the truth is no longer underground. It has emerged in all its terrifying light. Mercy's notebooks became the ultimate evidence. In careful, neat handwriting was a list of 67 victims spanning 8 years, a staggering number that far exceeded initial suspicion and perhaps one of the largest murder sprees in American history. The most haunting evidence, however, was found in a subterranean room that Ezekiel called God's courtroom. There, dimly lit, was a crude wooden lectern that served as a trial decorated with twisted religious symbols. But most horrifying of all, the room was filled with trophies he kept as medals of honor, scalps, jewelry, weapons, and mementos taken from his victims. It was not just a murderer's collection, but a museum of death, reflecting the deep depravity and sick pride of a family steeped in delusions of holiness. The confrontation with the Hardins was swift but bloody. Ezekiel and his sons, refusing to surrender, chose to fight to the end in the familiar network of caves they had turned into a fortress over the years. When they were discovered, Ezekiel showed no surprise. Instead, he launched into a lengthy sermon on divine judgment, preaching even as gunfire echoed off the cliffs. Caleb and Josiah fought back like cornered animals, using every nook and cranny of the cave system to ambush and attack. The fight lasted nearly an hour, raging through the narrow rocky passages that had been carefully prepared to serve as death traps. Meanwhile, above ground, Temperance, realizing the battle was over, tried to destroy the evidence by setting fire to the main house. The fire spread rapidly through the dry timbers, threatening to burn down the only entrance to the underground. Caught between life and death, the surviving members of the family were finally forced to lay down their weapons. Only Mercy surrendered willingly, as if she knew she had passed the point of no return. She was found kneeling in her room, eyes closed, hands clasped in silent prayer. Not out of remorse, but out of fear. The terror that her own father, in his deepening paranoia, would see her as a traitor, deserving of death. News of the Hardins' arrest quickly spread throughout Kentucky and beyond the frontier, forcing the community to confront a terrible truth. A family considered honorable was the mastermind behind dozens of mysterious disappearances over nearly a decade. What was found in the cave system far exceeded all speculation. Investigators discovered a network of limestone caverns stretching more than 2 miles, expanded and reinforced enough to hold dozens of people at a time. Evidence suggests that these were not random killings, but a systematic, calculated mass murder that operated like a machine. In addition to the 67 victims recorded by Mercy investigators, found numerous personal effects and unidentified remains, a sign that the true number of victims may have been much higher. Most horrifying was the discovery of children's clothing and toys among the evidence. Whole families were murdered. The Henleys, who disappeared during a December blizzard, were held in a cave for a week before being executed. The 2 children, aged just 6 and 8, were separated from their parents, lived for a few more days, then were also killed and thrown into the deepest part of the cave. The Hardin's trial began in late June 1799, lasted nearly a month, and drew crowds from all over Kentucky and neighboring territories. Victims' relatives, legal experts, and countless curious onlookers packed the courtroom each day. The crimes presented in court were so numerous and so horrifying that Judge Samuel Whitmore ordered some of the testimony sealed to avoid shocking the public. Ezekiel Hardin, standing before the judge, showed no remorse. Instead, he viewed the courtroom as a pulpit where he continued to preach about holy war and the righteousness of the divine mission he believed his family had been entrusted with to purge those unworthy to exist on God's land. For Ezekiel Hardin, the money and goods taken from his victims were not theft. They were his just reward, divine wages for his God-given mission. The underground cave system, he said, was not a prison but God's courthouse where justice would be administered according to strict biblical principles. At trial, Ezekiel's wife and children maintained their innocence. They claimed they had been coerced into participating, threatened by their father's religious fanaticism and violence. Temperance, his wife, testified that her medical knowledge was used to keep the victims alive for gruesome rituals. Caleb and Josiah said their father had brainwashed the family into believing they were fighting a holy war against demonic forces invading their community. However, these excuses were quickly dismissed. Both physical evidence and testimony showed that each family member had actively and enthusiastically participated in the murders. The entries in Mercy's diary were not only in her own handwriting, but also in the handwriting of each family member, providing clear evidence that they had all participated in recording their crimes as if it were a daily routine. In their private rooms, a series of personal items belonging to the victims were found, kept as souvenirs, as trophies. While the motive may have been money, it was clear that the killings brought them a much more terrifying psychological pleasure. Only Mercy showed genuine remorse. Though her cooperation with the authorities was motivated more by fear than by conscience, what she provided helped reconstruct the entire crime, the victims' identities, the timing, the manner of their imprisonment, and the location of their bodies. For that, Mercy's sentence was commuted not because she was forgiven, but because she had helped expose the truth. Still, her sentence was severe life in prison. She would spend the remaining 43 years of her life in a Kentucky prison, becoming one of the longest-serving inmates in the state's history. For the others, Ezekiel, Temperance, Caleb, and Josiah, the verdict was swift death by hanging set for August 15, 1799. The date was no coincidence. It was exactly a year since Samuel Fletcher disappeared, and from then on, all the terrible secrets were revealed. The execution was an unprecedented event. More than 4,000 people came from all over, turning the day into a somber carnival. Stalls sprang up like a fair selling food and drink to the curious, eager to witness the end of the most notorious, murderous family on the frontier. Ezekiel, even as he stood at the gallows, did not renounce his sick faith. His last words were a lengthy sermon, cursing the community for betraying God's will, warning that divine wrath would fall on Kentucky for destroying God's chosen ones. His wife and children, on the other hand, died in silence. No last words, no tears. Just a cold end to one of the bloodiest chapters in early American criminal history. Soon after, the entire Hardin farm burned to the ground. The fire consumed every wall, every door, a cleansing ritual helping the community shed the haunting that had once cast a shadow over the land. And the cave system below, it wasn't just filled in. The government dynamited it dumped tons of rock and buried every entrance. It was a final declaration. It was now a tomb. No one was allowed to dig, build, or even come near it again. But you know what? Even though the fire was out and the rocks were filled in, the memories remained. What the Hardins left behind was more than just pain. It was a turning point in how frontier communities viewed hospitality, vigilance, and wilderness justice. The Hardin case ended not only with gallows and ashes, but also left a lasting mark on the law. New laws about background checks for land purchases and new procedures for investigating missing persons arose from the horrors the family had unleashed. But perhaps its greatest impact lay elsewhere. It awakened a frontier region to the realization that blind faith in religious authority could mask the darkest things. People began to look at their own neighborhoods, neighbors, friends, even relatives with a more cautious eye. They now knew that a facade of sanctimony could be a mask. The trials that followed the Hardin case also set important precedents for the use of circumstantial evidence in capital cases and for the protection of cooperating witnesses. It was Mercy Hardin's testimony that paved the way for similar prosecutions, showing that family loyalties could be broken with enough motivation and protection. By 1801, the entire case file had been sealed by the court, accessible only to police and academics, and even they had to sign confidentiality agreements. This was partly to protect the victims' families, but also because the authorities feared that other sadists might copy the Hardins' murders, seeing them as a model plan for their crimes. For nearly 2 centuries, the truth was buried in secret files, with only a few fragments surviving, as folklore vague rumors of bad people who lived on Beaver Creek and the Hardin farm. As time went on, its actual location became more and more obscure. No one could remember it ever existed. By the mid-19th century, only a few old men were still lucid enough to point to the right plot of land. It wasn't until 1987 when the documents were declassified and historians finally pieced together the whole picture. Strangely enough, many questions remained unanswered. The cave system where the family dumped the victims' bodies has never been fully explored. It is believed that bodies still lie in the deepest recesses, places that 18th century investigators could not reach. While modern forensic techniques might reveal more re-excavating the area would be extremely expensive and dangerous, local authorities were not keen either. They would rather let the dead rest in peace than reawaken the pain that could traumatize the victims' descendants. And perhaps most chilling of all, the Hardin story has forced historians to reconsider hundreds of disappearances along the frontier during the early years of American expansion. How many victims were actually killed by respectable families like the Hardins and never found? Statistics show clusters of unusual disappearances have occurred near wealthy philanthropic families in Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. There's no concrete evidence, but the similarities are enough to send a chill down one's spine. Those answers died with Ezekiel Hardin on the morning of August 15th, 1799. But the questions remain lingering, nagging, unrelenting. They remind us that evil often has a benign face, that the worst criminals in human history were often people who believed they were doing the right thing. And the wild, chaotic era of American expansion has inadvertently created conditions for these twisted souls to hide and act in the shadows. This story is also a valuable lesson in the fragility of isolated communities where honor is valued over evidence and trust is more important than vigilance. The Hardin succeeded not only because of their tricks but also because their neighbors chose to turn a blind eye, refusing to see the signs of abnormality, to maintain a false sense of security. The price of that silence measured in the lives of many innocent people. This story shows frontier justice is not as simple as the history books describe. The expansion westward not only opened up opportunities for the good, but also created an ideal playground for predators who knew how to exploit the trust and desperation of travelers. What do you think of this story? Has it all been revealed? Or is there a darker secret lurking beneath the Kentucky soil? How many more families like the Hardin family existed that we never knew about? Leave a comment below and share your theories. If you found this story intriguing and want to hear more creepy stories, be sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and send this video to a friend who also loves unsolved mysteries. See you in the next episode of Sleepy History Tales.